My brother David hit my son Ben while I was away at work, something my mother witnessed but didn't stop, according to what my 10-year-old told me through tears. At the confrontation at my parents' house that same evening, my brother David cried as he admitted to slapping Ben once after Ben repeated something vile about David's black wife Maya. Word-for-word quotes he'd learned from our parents during Sunday dinners I don't attend. The living room went silent except for my father's chair creaking as he shifted his weight, my mother's hand frozen halfway to her coffee cup, and David's shoulders shaking as he stared at the floor. Ben stood behind me, his handprint still faintly visible on his cheek, confusion written across his face because he didn't understand why Uncle David had gotten so angry when he was just telling the truth like Grandma and Grandpa always said. I watched my parents exchange a glance, that particular look of people caught doing something they thought they'd hidden successfully. My mother's lips pressing together before she opened her mouth to say that David had overreacted to a child's innocent comment. My father stood up from his recliner, 6 feet tall and still imposing at 68, and told David that he needed to control his temper and apologize to Ben for putting his hands on him. I'm a single father, have been since Ben's mother died when he was 3, and I'd trusted my parents to help me raise him while I worked double shifts as an ER nurse to keep us afloat. They'd volunteered enthusiastically, insisting that Sunday dinners and weekend visits were exactly what Ben needed, that family was everything, and I'd been grateful because childcare costs would have buried me. David had moved back to our hometown 2 years ago, with his wife Maya and their baby daughter, and I'd noticed the tension at family gatherings I occasionally attended, the way conversations would stop when Maya entered a room. How my mother never quite looked at her directly. I'd chalked it up to my parents being old-fashioned, slow to adjust, uncomfortable with change the way people their age sometimes were, and I'd never pushed because I needed their help with Ben and couldn't afford to rock the boat. But standing in that living room, listening to my father demand an apology from my brother for defending his wife, watching Ben's innocent face as he waited to see if Uncle David would say sorry for hitting him, I felt something cold and clear settle into my chest. My mother started talking about how they'd only been teaching Ben about traditional values and how things used to be, that they never used those words exactly, just explained history and their concerns about mixed marriages. David's wife Maya appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, her face carefully blank in that way I recognized from my patients who'd learned to show nothing, while everything inside them broke. And she picked up their baby's carrier without a word. "Say what you told me again, Ben," I said quietly, and my son looked uncertain now, glancing at his grandparents who'd always given him candy and $20 bills and told him he was special. The words that came out of his mouth made David flinch like he'd been struck again, made Maya's careful mask crack just slightly around her eyes, and they were my parents' words filtered through a child's understanding, stripped of their polite coating. My father moved toward Ben with his hand out like he was going to ruffle his hair, say something about boys being boys, but I stepped between them. "We're leaving," I told David and Maya, not my parents. And I saw something pass between me and my brother in that moment, a recognition that we'd both been operating with incomplete information. My mother tried to hug Ben on our way out, cooing about how she'd see him next weekend. And I felt my son lean into her embrace automatically, this woman who'd been poisoning him every Sunday for months. David caught my arm at the door, his voice low and raw, asking if we could talk soon. Really talk. And I saw that he'd been carrying this alone while I'd been oblivious, working my shifts and sleeping through my exhaustion while my parents taught my son to hate his uncle's family. In my car, Ben cried differently than he had before, asking why he'd made Uncle David and Aunt Maya so sad when he was just repeating what Grandma had taught him about being proud of his heritage. I drove past our street, kept going until I reached David's house, and when Maya opened the door, her face showed surprise and something else, maybe hope, or maybe just the desperate wish that someone in this family saw her as human. David came to stand behind her, their baby between them, and I realized I'd been so focused on surviving each day that I'd let my parents rebuild my son in their image while I wasn't looking. "Tell me everything," I said, and over the next 3 hours I learned about comments made during holiday dinners, about my mother's suggestions that David's marriage was a phase, about my father's lectures on racial purity, disguised as concern for their daughter's future. Maya showed me text messages my mother had sent, carefully worded plausible deniability wrapped around clear intent, and screenshots of Facebook posts my father shared that he thought she couldn't see. Ben fell asleep on their couch while David explained that he'd finally snapped today when Ben had repeated their father's exact phrasing about Maya's hair being unprofessional and unkempt. the same words my father had used to Maya's face at Thanksgiving. "I shouldn't have hit him," David said, and Maya squeezed his hand, her face showing the weight of defending someone who'd struck her nephew while knowing exactly what that nephew had been taught. I looked at my parents' messages on Maya's phone, at the documentation she'd been keeping like evidence for a trial she'd never thought she'd get to present, and I felt that cold, clear thing in my chest expand. My mother had been careful, always so careful, teaching Ben her poison during activities that looked innocent from the outside. Baking cookies while talking about traditional families, going to the park while pointing out those people who weren't like us, framing her racism as protection and love. "He's 10, I said, watching my son sleep, knowing that at 10 years old the damage might already be irreversible, that my parents had gotten to him during the years when his personality was forming. Maya excused herself, said she needed to check on the baby, but I saw her shoulders shaking as she left the room. David stared at his hands. The same hands that had slapped my son, the same hands that had held his daughter minutes after she was born, while our father made a joke about checking her skin tone. I'd been a nurse for 12 years, had seen what happened to families torn apart by secrets and poisonous beliefs, had held the hands of dying patients who spent their last moments regretting the bridges they'd burned. But I'd also seen what happened when infections weren't treated, when people ignored spreading disease because dealing with it was uncomfortable, when they chose enabling over healing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, my mother texting to say she hoped I wasn't too upset, that they could talk about this misunderstanding next Sunday when things had calmed down, that Ben was always welcome in their home where he was truly loved. I looked at that text message for a long time, at the casual assumption that this would blow over like every other time anyone had pushed back against their behavior, at the confidence that their position as Ben's primary caregivers gave them untouchable status. Then I looked at Maya standing in the doorway with tears on her face, at David's slumped shoulders carrying months of isolated suffering, at my son sleeping peacefully after a day when he'd been both victim and weapon. My parents had used my desperate need for help to gain access to my child, had exploited my trust to create another generation of themselves, and they'd done it with such patience and care that I'd never suspected until the moment David's composure finally shattered. "I need copies of everything you have," I told Maya, and something flickered in her eyes, the first real hope I'd seen there all night. David sat up straighter, looked between his wife and me, and I saw the question forming before he asked it. "Yes," I answered, and my voice sounded different to my own ears, stripped of the exhaustion and guilt and desperate gratitude that had made me blind. "I'm going to make sure they never get near Ben again, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who they are. My parents had built their empire of hate slowly and carefully, had waited until I was too tired and too desperate to notice what they were doing, had probably started the moment they realized David was serious about Maya and their worldview was being rejected. They'd seen Ben as their second chance, a blank slate they could fill while his father worked himself to exhaustion, and thanked them for their sacrifice. But they'd made a critical mistake in their careful planning. They'd assumed that when push came to shove, I'd choose survival over truth, that my need for their help would outweigh everything else. I stayed at David's house until midnight, making copies of messages and screenshots, writing down dates and quotes Ben had repeated, building a timeline of exactly how my parents had operated. Maya kept adding details, things she'd pushed down and tried to ignore, moments when my mother's mask had slipped just slightly. David made calls to his wife's family, to friends who'd witnessed incidents at gatherings, people who'd stayed quiet because they hadn't wanted to cause problems but who were ready now to speak up. When I finally drove Ben home, his head heavy against my shoulder as I carried him inside, I thought about the Sunday dinners he'd never attend again, the weekends that would need new routines, the explanations I'd have to give about why Grandma and Grandpa weren't in our lives anymore. But I also thought about the person he'd become if I did nothing, about Maya's careful blank face, about David crying in his parents' living room while they demanded he apologize for refusing to accept their poison. My phone buzzed again. My father this time, saying we needed to handle this within the family and not let outside influences change what had always worked fine before. I screenshot the message and sent it to David, adding it to the evidence, and then I put Ben to bed and sat in my kitchen with my laptop open. My parents were respected in their church, in their neighborhood, known as devoted grandparents and pillars of the community, and they'd built that reputation over decades of careful performance. They thought that reputation would protect them, that people would choose comfortable fiction over uncomfortable truth. Tomorrow morning, I'd call my supervisor and request family leave. Tomorrow afternoon, I'd call a lawyer. Tomorrow evening, I'd start making phone calls to extended family, to my parents' friends, to everyone who'd ever commented on what devoted grandparents they were. But tonight, I sat in my kitchen and thought about revenge, about the difference between justice and punishment, about what my son needed versus what my rage demanded. My parents had taught Ben to hate, had used my love for him as the weapon to wound my brother's family, and they'd done it with such conviction that they genuinely believed they were right. I'd spent 12 years learning how to treat infections, how to cut away disease before it spread, how to make the hard choices that saved lives even when they caused pain. My parents were an infection, had been spreading through Ben's mind for months, and the treatment was going to hurt. But infections left untreated killed everything they touched, and I'd already waited too long while symptoms I should have recognized went ignored. Maya's haunted eyes, David's breaking point, Ben's innocent repetition of vile words, these were the symptoms of disease I'd let spread because I'd been too tired and too desperate to see it. The cold, clear thing in my chest had a name now, and it wasn't rage or hatred or even pain. It was clarity, the kind that came in the ER when everything suddenly made sense and you knew exactly what needed to be done to save the patient. My parents had gambled that I'd choose the comfortable lie over the difficult truth, that I'd protect them to protect myself and Ben from the upheaval of losing their help. They'd miscalculated badly, had never considered that some infections required cutting away healthy tissue to stop the spread, that sometimes the only way to save something was to accept the loss of what you thought you needed. I pulled up my email and started typing, addressed to my parents with copies to David and Maya, and I laid out exactly what was going to happen next, the boundaries that would exist forever, the people who'd be informed of their behavior, the fact that they'd never see Ben again without court supervision. My finger hovered over the send button for a long moment, because once I sent this message, there'd be no going back, no Sunday dinners even if I changed my mind, no emergency childcare when I was desperate. But then I thought about Ben's confused face asking why Uncle David was so upset, about Maya documenting abuse like evidence she thought no one would ever want to see, and I hit send. The response came within minutes. My mother calling my phone, my father sending texts demanding I delete the email immediately. I turned my phone off and went to check on Ben, watched him sleep with his stuffed bear clutched to his chest, and I wondered how long it would take to undo the damage my parents had done. Tomorrow would bring consequences I couldn't fully predict, would start a process that would hurt even as it healed. But tonight, I sat in the darkness of my son's room and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Absolutely certain I was doing the right thing. My parents had built their fortress carefully, had never considered that the son they'd raised to value family above all else might someday value his son's soul more than their approval. They'd weaponized my love and exhaustion, had exploited my trust during my most vulnerable time, and they'd done it with such confidence that they documented their own poison in text messages and Facebook posts. Tomorrow I'd use their own weapons against them, would let their carefully crafted words destroy the reputation they'd built over decades, and they'd never see it coming because they genuinely believed they'd done nothing wrong. The next morning, I called out from work for the first time in 3 years, spoke to my supervisor, Linda, who'd heard me come in on days off without complaint, who approved 2 weeks family leave immediately without asking questions. Ben woke up asking about school, and I told him we'd be staying home today, that we needed to talk about some things, and his face went through several emotions before settling on wariness. I made breakfast while he sat at the kitchen table picking at his fingernails, a nervous habit he'd developed over the past few months that I'd attributed to normal childhood anxiety. What Uncle David did was wrong, I started, and Ben's shoulders relaxed slightly, ready to hear what he'd expected. But what you said to him was worse. His head snapped up, confusion crossing his face, and I pulled out my phone with the recordings I'd made last night with David and Maya's permission. For the next hour, Ben listened to his aunt and uncle describe what it felt like to hear those words, what it was like to be judged by skin color, how his grandparents had been teaching him to see people as less than human. He cried several times, not the confused tears from yesterday, but something deeper, the sound of a child realizing he'd been used. My parents started calling around 9 a.m., texts flooding my phone with increasing desperation as they realized the email I'd sent wasn't a temporary emotional reaction. My mother's messages evolved from concerned to angry to threatening within 20 minutes, each one revealing more of the person she'd hidden behind grandmotherly devotion. "You're being influenced by David's situation," one text read. "That woman has poisoned your mind against your own family," read another. I screenshot each message and forwarded them to the lawyer I'd contacted at 7 a.m., a civil rights attorney named Jessica Park, who specialized in discrimination cases and who'd been very interested in the documentation Maya had collected. David arrived around 10 with Maya and their daughter, and I watched Ben's reaction carefully when they walked in. He stood up from the couch, started to back away, then stopped himself and walked forward instead. "I'm sorry, Aunt Maya," he said, his voice small but clear. "I didn't understand. Grandma made it sound like truth, but it was just being mean." Maya knelt down to his level, her eyes wet, and she told him that 10-year-olds shouldn't have to apologize for what adults taught them, but that she appreciated his words more than he knew. The four of us sat down, and I laid out what I'd started putting in motion. Lawyer consultations, documentation of everything my parents had said and done, a formal complaint to their church leadership about their conduct. David looked shocked, Maya looked cautiously hopeful, and Ben asked if this meant he'd never see Grandma and Grandpa again. "Not until you're old enough to protect yourself from them," I answered, and his face showed relief before guilt crashed over it. "It's okay to miss people who hurt you," Maya said gently. "It's okay to love them and still need to stay away." My phone rang, my father this time, and I put it on speaker. His voice filled my kitchen with righteous anger, demanding to know what I thought I was doing, threatening to sue for grandparents' rights, insisting they'd done nothing but love Ben and guide him properly. David's jaw clenched with each word, and I let my father talk himself into a corner before responding. "I'm recording this conversation, Dad. My lawyer is listening. Would you like to repeat that part about proper guidance and explain what that means?" The line went dead immediately, and Jessica Park's text came through seconds later. "Perfect. He just established their intent." The church meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, an emergency session with the pastor and elders that my parents had demanded, thinking they'd get support for their position as longtime members. I'd sent Pastor Williams the documentation 3 hours earlier. Screenshots of my father's Facebook posts, copies of messages my mother had sent to Maya, recordings of things Ben had repeated that he'd learned during Sunday school classes my mother taught. David and Maya came with me, leaving Ben with Maya's sister, and we walked into that church conference room to find my parents already seated with confident expressions that crumbled slightly when they saw Maya. Pastor Williams looked older than I remembered, his face drawn with the kind of exhaustion that came from discovering something rotten in an institution you'd built your life around. He'd been at that church for 30 years, had baptized me and David, had performed David's wedding ceremony despite my parents' objections. "I've reviewed the materials Marcus sent," he said quietly, and my mother started to interrupt, but he raised his hand. 23 years. That's how long you've been teaching children Sunday school, Patricia. How many children did you expose to these views? My mother's face went white, then red, and she started talking about traditional values and biblical interpretation and how the church was becoming too influenced by modern liberalism. Pastor Williams let her talk, let her dig the hole deeper with each word, and I saw the exact moment she realized she'd misread the room. The elders sat in silence, faces showing various degrees of anger and disappointment. And when my mother finally stopped talking, Elder Johnson spoke up. "Your resignation from all church positions is effective immediately," he said, his voice flat. "We'll be contacting the families of every child you've taught to offer counseling and apology." My father stood up, pointed at David and Maya, and said something so vile that 2 elders physically recoiled. Pastor Williams stood as well, his voice shaking with anger as he told my parents to leave church property immediately and not return until they'd completed racial sensitivity training and made formal apologies to everyone they'd harmed. "This is persecution," my mother hissed. "We're being punished for being faithful." Maya's hand found mine under the table, squeezed hard, and I squeezed back as we watched my parents' fortress crumble around them. They left the church, but not quietly. My mother shouting about discrimination and modern corruption, my father's face purple with rage. 2 families in the parking lot heard everything, pulled out their phones to record, and I knew those videos would be circulating through the congregation within hours. Pastor Williams asked us to stay, spent another hour discussing how to address the damage my parents had done, and mentioned that 3 other families had come forward after seeing my email to report similar concerning statements my mother had made to their children. David drove us home in silence, his hands tight on the steering wheel, and when we pulled into my driveway, he finally spoke. "They're going to blame me for all of this," he said. "They'll tell everyone I turned you against them, that Maya corrupted the family." Maya turned in her seat to look at her husband, her face showing steel beneath the softness. "Let them," she said. "Every word they say just proves why this needed to happen." That evening, my extended family started calling. Aunt Rachel first, my father's sister, who'd apparently received a frantic call from my mother painting themselves as victims of David's vindictive wife. I sent Aunt Rachel the complete documentation and listened to her shocked silence as she read through messages she couldn't deny or explain away. Uncle Tom called next, then Cousin Jennifer, and to each one I provided evidence and watched their support for my parents evaporate. By 8 p.m., my mother's sister had called to say that Mom and Dad were no longer welcome at the family reunion next month, that she was horrified by what she'd seen, and that she'd never let them near her biracial grandchildren again. My parents' carefully built reputation was collapsing in real time, and each falling piece revealed more rot underneath. Former neighbors came forward with stories they'd minimized at the time. Church members remembered comments that suddenly made sense in new context, and my mother's book club quietly removed her from their roster. The next morning, my father's golf buddies canceled their weekly game, and my mother found herself uninvited from the charity board she'd served on for 15 years. I should have felt guilty watching their world disintegrate, but instead, I felt that cold clarity expanding. They'd built everything on performance and careful words, on being charming to the right people while poisoning the vulnerable, and now the foundation was exposed as hollow. Ben asked me that night if Grandma and Grandpa were okay, and I told him honestly that they were facing consequences for their choices, that sometimes people who hurt others lose the things they value most. Jessica Park called to say we had enough documentation to ensure my parents would never get court-ordered visitation, that their own words had built an impenetrable case against them. David sent a message that his in-laws wanted to meet me properly, that Maya's parents had been waiting years for someone in my family to see their daughter as human. And my phone stayed silent from my parents for the first time in memory, because they'd finally realized that nothing they could say would undo what they'd done to themselves. The lawyer's office smelled like coffee and leather when I arrived Monday morning, with 3 folders of documentation that had grown substantially over the weekend. Jessica Park looked through everything with the methodical focus of someone who'd seen too many similar cases, her expression darkening as she read text messages my mother had sent to Maya that I hadn't known existed. "Your mother told her that mixed-race children face harder lives and maybe she should reconsider having more," Jessica said, her voice tight. She said this while Maya was 6 months pregnant with their daughter. I felt my stomach turn, thinking about Maya carrying that message through her pregnancy, about David knowing his mother had said this to his wife. Jessica pulled out a legal pad and started outlining the case for a restraining order, explaining that my parents' documented pattern of harassment and their stated intentions to continue influencing Ben constituted grounds for protection. "The grandparents' rights angle they threatened is dead on arrival with this evidence," she said. "No judge will grant visitation to people actively teaching hate speech to minors." That afternoon, I met with Ben's school counselor, showed her the documentation of what my parents had been teaching him, and enrolled him in therapy starting that week. The counselor, Mrs. Chen, had worked with children recovering from familial indoctrination before and warned me it would be a long process. 10 is young enough that we can reshape his thinking, she explained. But he'll grieve the loss of his grandparents even knowing what they did. Children love who they love regardless of whether it's healthy. David called during my drive home to say that our parents had shown up at his workplace, that security had to escort them out after they caused a scene in the lobby demanding to speak with him. "Dad said I was destroying the family," David's voice shook. "He said Maya had used black magic or something to turn me against my own blood." His co-workers heard everything. I pulled over to the side of the road, gripping the steering wheel as David described how our father had ranted about traditional values and racial purity in front of 20 people in his office building, how someone had recorded it and sent it to HR. "He's going to lose his consulting contracts," David said, and I heard the complicated grief in his voice, the pain of watching your parents self-destruct even when they deserved it. Our father had spent 40 years building a reputation as a leadership consultant for corporate clients, had charged premium rates for his expertise in team building and organizational culture. Now those same clients were receiving videos of him spewing racist ideology in a professional setting, and the contracts were already being terminated. My mother's situation deteriorated faster. Someone from her former church had posted the full story on the community Facebook group, and within 48 hours, everyone in their social circle knew exactly what had happened. The grocery store manager asked her to shop elsewhere after she berated a black cashier. Her gym revoked her membership after complaints from other patrons. The HOA in their neighborhood received a petition signed by 30 families requesting their removal from the board, citing concerns about discriminatory practices in community decisions. I documented everything, every consequence they faced, because I knew they'd eventually try to claim persecution and victimhood. Jessica Park had advised me to keep records of their continued behavior, and my parents were cooperating beautifully by refusing to accept responsibility. My mother started a blog about traditional families under attack, which lasted 3 days before the hosting company shut it down for violating terms of service. My father tried to organize a protest at David's workplace, which resulted in a trespassing warning and made the local news. Ben's therapy sessions were revealing just how deep the indoctrination had gone. He'd repeat things in session that made Mrs. Chen's professional mask slip. Concepts about racial hierarchy and cultural purity that my mother had packaged as historical facts and family heritage. She told him he was special because of his bloodline, Mrs. Chen reported after the third session. She created an entire mythology around your family's supposed genetic superiority. The nausea returned, stronger this time, understanding that my mother had been grooming my son for white supremacy while I thanked her for babysitting. Maya invited me to dinner at their house that weekend, and I arrived to find her extended family there. Parents, siblings, cousins, all gathering to meet me properly. Her father, a retired professor, pulled me aside and said something I'd carry forever. My daughter has been married to your brother for 3 years. This is the first time she's felt safe enough to bring our families together. Thank you for seeing her. The weight of those words settled over me, the realization that Maya had been managing this isolation for years, protecting her family from my parents' toxicity while pretending everything was fine. During dinner, Maya's mother asked Ben about school and his interests, normal grandmotherly questions, and I watched him respond with growing comfort. Her sister's kids played with him in the yard, 3 children who looked like him, but whom my parents would have called inappropriate playmates. David caught my eye across the table, and I saw the grief there mixed with relief, the complicated emotions of gaining everything you'd been missing while losing everything you'd thought you needed. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. My parents had hired a lawyer, an older man named Richard Stone, who'd apparently built his career on grandparents' rights cases. He clearly expected a sympathetic judge and a case about alienation and parental overreaction. Jessica Park let him present his opening arguments, let him paint my parents as devoted grandparents being punished for traditional values, and then she started introducing evidence. Stone's face changed as Jessica presented text message after text message, Facebook post after Facebook post, each one more damning than the last. My mother had documented her own ideology meticulously, had been so confident in her rightness that she'd never considered her words might be used against her. The judge, a black woman in her 50s named Judge Martinez, read through the evidence in silence before looking up at my parents. "Mrs. Rivera," she said, her voice controlled, "you taught Sunday school for over 20 years?" My mother nodded, starting to smile, thinking this was going in her favor. "And in that time, you used your position of authority to teach children that racial mixing was morally wrong?" The smile died. "You told your grandson that his aunt was inferior due to her race?" My mother tried to speak, but Judge Martinez held up her hand. "I've seen many cases in my courtroom. I've never seen such clear documentation of systematic racist indoctrination of a minor." The restraining order was granted immediately. 500 feet minimum distance, no direct or indirect contact with Ben, no contact with David's family. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. She ordered a full investigation into my mother's Sunday school teachings, mandated that my parents complete a racial sensitivity program at their own expense, and noted in the record that any violation would result in immediate criminal charges. "You used love as a weapon," Judge Martinez said. looking directly at my mother. You exploited your grandson's trust to fill him with hate. That is child abuse, and I will not allow it to continue. Outside the courtroom, Richard Stone pulled my father aside for a heated conversation I couldn't hear, but could read in their body language. He was dropping them as clients, I realized, unwilling to attach his name to a case this toxic. My mother stood alone on the courthouse steps, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her, and for a moment I felt something that might have been pity before I remembered Maya's face when she showed me those text messages about her pregnancy. David approached them against my advice, and I watched from a distance as he said something that made our father's face go purple. Later, David told me what he'd said. You spent my whole life teaching me that family was everything. Turns out you meant family that looks like you want them to look. Our mother had reached for him, and he'd stepped back, putting physical distance between them that represented the chasm they'd created themselves. That evening, Aunt Rachel called to say that several family members were planning a gathering at her house without inviting my parents, that they wanted to meet Maya and her family properly, to show support for David and me. We should have done this years ago, she admitted. We all saw the signs, but it was easier to pretend your parents were just old-fashioned rather than admit what they really were. Uncle Tom had apparently broken down crying when he'd read the full documentation, ashamed that he'd defended his brother without knowing the extent of the damage. Ben asked me that night why people would hate Aunt Maya when she was so nice, and I struggled to find words that would explain human evil to a 10-year-old without traumatizing him further. Some people are scared of things that are different, I tried, and scared people sometimes turn mean. He considered this, then asked if Grandma and Grandpa were scared. I think they're terrified, I answered honestly. Terrified that the world is changing and they can't stop it. The family gathering at Aunt Rachel's house that weekend was everything my parents' dinners had never been. Maya's family mixed with my extended family naturally, children playing together while adults shared food and stories, and I saw Ben laughing with Maya's nieces without the guardedness he'd been carrying. David stood with his arm around Maya, no longer tense and watching for incoming attacks, and she leaned into him with visible relief. My mother tried to crash the gathering, showed up at Aunt Rachel's door demanding to be let in to see her family. Aunt Rachel, 5 feet tall and 70 years old, blocked the doorway and told her sister-in-law exactly what she thought of her behavior. The Ring camera captured the whole exchange, my mother's entitled rage meeting Aunt Rachel's steel resolve, ending with my mother being told that she was no longer welcome in any family gathering until she'd made genuine amends that no one believed she was capable of. My father's business collapsed completely within 2 weeks. Every corporate client terminated their contracts, and the leadership consulting firm he'd partnered with for 15 years released a statement condemning his views and severing all ties. He'd built his career on teaching others about inclusive workplace culture while harboring the exact opposite beliefs, and the hypocrisy destroyed any remaining professional credibility. Their retirement savings were substantial but not infinite, and without his income they'd need to sell the house they'd lived in for 30 years. I watched their world disintegrate with that same cold clarity, knowing that every consequence they faced came directly from their own documented actions. They'd created this disaster themselves, had planted every seed that was now bearing poison fruit, and they'd done it with such confidence that they'd never considered the possibility of exposure. The fortress they'd built over decades was rubble now, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Jessica Park called to say that 3 families from my mother's Sunday school classes were considering civil suits for emotional damages to their children. The church's insurance was investigating whether they'd be liable for allowing her continued access to children despite warning signs. And my parents were now locally famous in the worst possible way, their names associated with racism and hate in every community database and news archive. Ben showed me a picture he'd drawn in therapy. Our family now, including David and Maya and their daughter, Maya's extended family, and my parents off to the side in gray crayon. Mrs. Chen says it's okay to love people from far away, he explained. You can love them, but not let them hurt you anymore. I hung that picture on the refrigerator, a visual reminder that children understood justice better than adults pretended. The turning point came 6 weeks after the restraining order, when my father violated it by showing up at Ben's school. The principal called me immediately, her voice tight with controlled anger as she explained that my father had tried to check Ben out of class, claiming a family emergency. Security had stopped him, police were called, and he was arrested for violating a court order. Ben hadn't seen him, had been kept safely in the classroom while this unfolded, but the damage was in the intention. Jessica Park filed for an emergency hearing, and Judge Martinez was not pleased to see my parents in her courtroom again so soon. My father's new lawyer, a public defender since he could no longer afford private representation, tried to argue that my father had simply wanted to see his grandson and meant no harm. Judge Martinez cut him off mid-sentence. He violated a restraining order at a school, attempting to remove a minor from premises without legal authority. That's not grandparenting, that's attempted kidnapping. The sentence was 30 days in county jail with credit for time served, probation for 2 years, and an extension of the restraining order until Ben turned 18. My mother sat in the gallery sobbing, and I felt nothing watching her performance. She'd been given multiple opportunities to accept responsibility, to acknowledge the harm she'd caused, to change her behavior. Instead, she'd enabled my father's escalation, had probably encouraged it, and now they'd both face consequences they'd never imagined possible. David testified at the hearing about our father's increasingly unstable behavior, the threatening voicemails he'd been leaving, the social media posts calling David a traitor, and Maya a corrupting influence. Maya testified about the fear she'd lived with for 3 years, never knowing when my parents' carefully controlled prejudice would explode into something more dangerous. And I testified about watching my son recover from indoctrination, about the therapy sessions where he'd cried over the loss of his innocence, and the grandparents who'd betrayed his trust. The prosecution introduced evidence I hadn't known existed. My father had been researching custody laws, had contacted several lawyers about forcibly removing Ben from my care, had posted in online forums about parental alienation and grandparents' rights. He'd been planning an escalation long before showing up at the school, and the documentation proved premeditation. Judge Martinez ordered a psychiatric evaluation before sentencing, concern in her voice as she noted the progression from bigotry to obsession to illegal action. My mother was charged as an accessory after investigators found text messages where she'd encouraged my father's plans, had suggested specific strategies for gaining access to Ben, had framed it as rescuing him from my influence. Her bail was set at $50,000, which they couldn't afford after my father's business collapse, and she spent 3 days in jail before Aunt Rachel bailed her out against the advice of everyone in the family. She called me crying, Aunt Rachel explained when I questioned her decision. Said she was sorry, that she'd made mistakes, that she just wanted her family back. I asked if my mother had specifically acknowledged teaching racism to Ben, if she'd apologized for the harm to Maya, if she'd taken responsibility for anything beyond getting caught. Aunt Rachel's silence was answer enough. She's still playing victim, I said. She's sorry she got caught, not sorry for what she did. The psychiatric evaluation revealed what many of us had suspected. My father showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder with paranoid features, genuinely believed he was justified in all his actions, and demonstrated no capacity for genuine empathy or remorse. The psychologist's report recommended continued therapy, but noted that the prognosis for meaningful change was poor, given my father's age and resistance to acknowledging problematic beliefs. My mother's evaluation was gentler, but similarly damning. Dependent personality disorder, history of subjugating her own judgment to her husband's, genuine belief that her indoctrination of Ben had been loving guidance. Ben turned 11 while my father was in jail, and we celebrated at David and Maya's house with both sides of the family present. Maya's mother had made his favorite cake, and her father gave him a book about civil rights heroes that Ben immediately started reading. David pulled me aside during the party and said something that made my throat tight. 3 years. It took 3 years for someone in my family to choose us over them. I'd given up hoping. I'd spent those 3 years exhausted and grateful, oblivious to what was happening in my own family, and the shame of that would probably never fully fade. But shame without action was just another form of avoidance, and I'd learned that lesson thoroughly. My parents had counted on my exhaustion, my desperation, my willingness to accept help without questioning the cost. They'd been right until the moment David's hand struck Ben's face and shattered all the careful illusions. My father's sentencing hearing drew a surprising crowd, families from my mother's Sunday school classes, members of David's workplace who'd witnessed the lobby incident, church elders who wanted to see justice served. The prosecutor presented a powerful case about the progression of hateful ideology into criminal action, about the danger posed by people who believed their bigotry was righteous. My father's public defender did his best, but couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence his client had created through years of documented statements and recent illegal actions. 60 days in jail, 3 years probation, mandatory counseling, and permanent restrictions on contact with minors outside supervised therapeutic settings. Judge Martinez looked at my father directly as she delivered the sentence. You had every privilege this society offers, and you used it to spread hate and harm children. You betrayed the trust of your family, your church, and your community. You have shown no remorse and no understanding of why your actions were wrong. Until you can demonstrate genuine change, you are a danger to every vulnerable person in your orbit. My mother received 45 days with time served, 3 years probation, and the same restrictions. She'd tried to speak during the hearing, to explain that she'd only wanted to preserve her family's values, and Judge Martinez had let her talk long enough to demonstrate that she still didn't understand. You taught a child to hate, the judge said quietly. You took advantage of his love and trust to poison his developing worldview. That is not preserving values, Mrs. Rivera. That is abuse. Their house sold at a significant loss because the neighborhood association made sure every potential buyer knew exactly who was selling and why. They'd have to relocate to a different city, start over somewhere people didn't know their names or their history, and even that wouldn't erase the digital footprint they'd created. Their story had been covered by local media as a cautionary tale about hate in suburban communities, and a simple Google search would reveal everything to anyone who looked. I took Ben to visit my father in jail once, not to reconcile, but to let Ben see the consequences of choices clearly. My father tried to use the visit to manipulate Ben, to claim he'd been persecuted for loving his grandson, but Ben cut him off mid-sentence. You taught me to be mean, Ben said, his voice steady despite being 11 years old, facing down his grandfather. Mrs. Chen says that's called grooming, and it's what bad people do. My father's face went through several emotions before settling on rage, and the visit ended with guards escorting us out as he shouted about betrayal and corrupted children. I don't want to do that again, Ben said in the car, and I promised him he wouldn't have to. He'd seen what he needed to see. His grandfather unchanged and unrepentant, still believing he was the victim, still unable to recognize the harm he'd caused. That visit would be the last time Ben saw my father, and I felt relief rather than sadness knowing that chapter was permanently closed. Maya started a blog about recovering from familial racism, writing honestly about her experience with my parents and the isolation she'd endured. It went viral within weeks, shared by thousands of people who recognized their own stories in hers. She became a voice for partners dealing with prejudiced in-laws, for parents protecting their children from toxic grandparents, and she did it without hiding behind anonymity. My parents' names were in those blog posts, their actions documented, and they couldn't escape the accountability even if they'd wanted to. David got a promotion at work, his company making a public statement about supporting employees targeted by harassment and standing against hate. The incident with our father in the lobby had become a teaching moment about handling bigoted disruptions professionally, and David had handled it perfectly. His reputation had been enhanced while our parents was destroyed, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The extended family fully embraced David and Maya, and my parents found themselves isolated from everyone except a few equally problematic church members who'd left with them. Their new church, one that welcomed their views, was small and struggling, located in a strip mall between a vape shop and a payday loan place. They'd fallen from respected community pillars to fringe extremists, and the fall had been entirely self-inflicted. 8 months after my father's release from jail, my parents attempted one final manipulation. They sent letters to every family member, to church leaders, to mutual friends, claiming they'd undergone transformation and wanted to make amends. The letters were carefully crafted, probably with professional help, hitting all the right notes about accountability and growth and changed hearts. They were also completely hollow, as became clear when Aunt Rachel tested them by asking specific questions about what they'd learned and how they planned to demonstrate change. My mother's response to Aunt Rachel's questions revealed the truth. She was sorry people had been hurt, sorry there'd been misunderstandings, sorry that things had gotten blown out of proportion. She never once acknowledged teaching hate speech. She never mentioned Maya by name. She never took responsibility for indoctrinating Ben. The apology was a performance designed to regain access, nothing more, and Aunt Rachel forwarded the exchange to the entire family. My father's letter to me was more direct in its manipulation. claiming that Ben needed his grandfather's guidance now more than ever, that I was raising him in an environment that would confuse him about his heritage, that blood mattered more than politics. I read it twice looking for any sign of genuine change, any acknowledgement of actual wrongdoing, and found only confirmation that he remained dangerous. I forwarded it to Jessica Park, who added it to the file in case future legal action became necessary. Ben was doing better, making friends at school, including Maya's nieces who were in his grade, excelling in therapy, and showing genuine horror when he looked back at things he'd believed just months ago. I told Ashley that her dad was less than because he's from Mexico, he confessed during dinner one night, his face showing shame. I said it like it was just a fact, like Grandma taught me. She cried, and I didn't understand why. We talked about repairing that harm, about the long work of becoming better after being taught worse, and I felt grateful that he was learning these lessons at 11 rather than 40. David and Maya had another baby, a son they named Marcus after me, and I cried when they told me. "You gave us back our family," Maya said, holding my hand while her newborn slept. "You chose truth over comfort, and that's rare enough to deserve recognition." The baby's christening happened at Pastor William's church, surrounded by both sides of the family except for my parents, and the absence felt right rather than sad. My parents tried to show up at the christening anyway, were stopped in the parking lot by security that David had hired specifically for this possibility. They caused enough of a scene that police were called, another violation documented, another consequence faced. Judge Martinez revoked my father's probation and sent him back to jail for 90 days, and this time, my mother went with him for contempt of court. They'd been given every opportunity to accept boundaries and chosen to violate them at every turn. The day my father returned to jail, I felt something shift in my chest, that cold clarity transforming into something warmer. Not forgiveness. They'd never earn that, and I'd never offer it, but release. They couldn't hurt Ben anymore. They couldn't hurt Maya anymore. They couldn't hurt anyone who didn't choose to give them access. They'd isolated themselves so completely that even their attempts at manipulation only reinforced everyone's decision to keep them out. Ben asked me once if I thought Grandma and Grandpa would ever really change. "I think they'd have to admit they were wrong first," I answered, "and people who build their whole identity on being right can never do that. It would destroy everything they think they are." He nodded, processing this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned hard truths early. "So, we're safe because they can't change?" he asked. "We're safe because we don't need them to change," I corrected. "We're safe because we chose ourselves." A year after the initial confrontation, I took Ben to the cemetery where his mother was buried, something we did every few months. He talked to her headstone about his year, about Uncle David and Aunt Maya, about his new cousins and therapy and school. "I learned some bad things," he told her, "but Dad helped me unlearn them. You'd be proud of him." I stood back and let him have his moment, thinking about the woman who'd left us too early, but who'd loved Ben absolutely during the time she'd had. Would Mom have liked Grandma and Grandpa? Ben asked on the drive home. I thought about my wife Sarah, about her fierce protection of anyone vulnerable, about the social justice work she'd done before cancer took her. "No," I said honestly. "She'd have seen through them immediately and kept you safe." He smiled at that, satisfied that his mother would have made the same choices I'd made, and I felt her presence in the car with us, approval in the silence. My parents knew life was small and bitter, documented by mutual acquaintances who still lived in their new city. They'd joined a church that preached prosperity gospel and racial separation, had made friends with people who reinforced rather than challenged their worldview, and had dug themselves deeper into ideology that would keep them isolated forever. They sent Christmas cards every year with posed photos that looked hollow, trying to project the image of normal grandparents unjustly separated from their family. David burned the cards unopened every year, a small ritual of refusal. Maya kept a file of them as continued documentation, evidence that the manipulation never stopped even when it stopped working. And I explained to Ben each time they arrived that some people would rather be right than loved, would rather keep their hate than keep their family, and that was their choice to live with. The family gathering at Thanksgiving that year had 30 people, both sides of our combined family mixing naturally. Maya's father and Uncle Tom discussed baseball while cooking turkey together. Ben played with 5 cousins of various races and backgrounds without it being noteworthy. David stood in the kitchen with his arm around his wife, watching his children grow up in the family he'd built after the family he'd been born into rejected what he loved. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked me quietly while everyone else was distracted. "Blowing up everything for us?" I thought about Ben's therapy sessions, about Maya's blog reaching thousands of people, about Judge Martinez's words about love as a weapon. "I regret not seeing it sooner," I answered. "I regret every Sunday dinner I let happen. But destroying what they built, that I'd do again in a heartbeat." My parents tried one more manipulation when Ben turned 13. A letter directly to him, bypassing me entirely, filled with loving language and promises and appeals to his goodness. Ben read it carefully, then brought it to me and asked what I thought. "They're trying to use your kindness as a doorway," I said. "That's what they've always done. What do you think?" He took the letter back, read it again, then tore it in half. "I think they forgot I remember," he said. "I remember exactly what they taught me, and I remember how it felt when I learned it was wrong. I don't want to forget again." 5 years after the confrontation, my parents were essentially ghosts, people whose names came up occasionally in cautionary tales but who had no presence in our actual lives. My father had a heart attack at 66, survived but diminished, and my mother called to inform me with the expectation that this would crack the door open to reconciliation. I wished him recovery and ended the call, ignoring the guilt trip she attempted about dying alone and estranged from family. Ben was 15 now, confident and kind, vocal about social justice in ways that would have horrified my parents. He'd become president of his school's diversity club, volunteered with Maya at organizations supporting mixed-race families, and wrote an essay about recovering from childhood indoctrination that won a statewide competition. The essay mentioned my parents by name, described exactly what they'd taught him and how he'd unlearned it, and ended with a call for adults to protect children from familial extremism. My parents threatened to sue for defamation, then discovered that truth was an absolute defense, and that they'd documented everything themselves. The essay went viral when local media covered the legal threat, and suddenly my parents were infamous nationally rather than just locally. Their attempt to silence Ben had amplified his voice beyond anything we'd imagined, and the irony was perfect. David's company promoted him to director level, specifically citing his integrity during family crisis and his public stance against hate. Maya's blog had become a podcast, then a book deal, and she'd built a career helping others navigate toxic family systems. They'd bought a larger house to accommodate their growing family, and Sunday dinners there were everything my parents' dinners had never been: loud, chaotic, loving, and radically inclusive. Ben asked me once if I ever missed them, if there were good memories buried under all the harm. "There are memories," I admitted, "but they're complicated now. I remember your grandma teaching you to bake, but I also remember that she used that time to poison your mind. I remember your grandpa teaching you to fish, but I also remember he used those trips to teach you who to hate. Good actions in service of bad goals aren't really good actions." My mother made one final attempt at manipulation when Ben turned 16, appearing at his school play despite the restraining order that was still in effect. Security removed her before Ben saw her, police arrested her for the 5th violation, and Judge Martinez, who'd been following the case for years, sent her to jail for 6 months. "You have been given every opportunity to respect boundaries," the judge said wearily. "You have chosen obsession over respect at every turn. Perhaps 6 months will finally teach you what 5 years hasn't." My father sent a letter after my mother's incarceration, blaming me for destroying our mother, claiming I'd always been vindictive and cruel. I read it to David over the phone, both of us analyzing the projection and deflection, the complete inability to see himself clearly. "He'll die believing he's the victim," David said. "He'll never understand what he actually was." I agreed, and we talked about how that was his tragedy to carry, not ours. Ben graduated high school with honors, gave a speech about the importance of choosing who you become over who you were taught to be, and was accepted to 6 colleges, including his first choice. Maya and her family came to the graduation. My extended family came. David's friends and colleagues came, and 200 people celebrated Ben's achievement. My parents were not there, would never be there, and the absence was a gift rather than a loss. At the graduation party, Uncle Tom pulled me aside with tears in his eyes. "I should have done what you did years ago," he said. "When David first brought Maya home and your parents started their campaign, I should have stood up to my brother. I told myself it wasn't my business, that families work things out privately. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I accepted his apology, knowing it was genuine because he'd spent 5 years proving it through actions, through choosing us repeatedly, through never wavering in his support. Aunt Rachel was more direct. You saved that boy. You saved your brother's family. You saved all of us from continuing to be complicit in hate. That takes more courage than most people ever find. She pressed a photo into my hand, one she'd found in my parents' house when she'd helped them move. Me and David as children, arms around each other, smiling without complication. This is who they lost, she said. Remember that when you doubt yourself. My parents' final chapter played out predictably, isolated in their bitterness, surrounded only by people who reinforced their victimhood narrative, unable to accept responsibility for the family they'd destroyed through their own choices. My father's health continued to decline, and my mother's attempts to use his condition as leverage failed completely. They'd cried wolf too many times, manipulated too often, and no one trusted their emergencies anymore. I saw them once more by accident, at a grocery store in their new city where I'd gone for work. They were older, smaller, diminished in ways that went beyond physical aging. My father pushed the cart while my mother selected items, and they moved with the careful coordination of people who had only each other. My father saw me first, his face going through surprise and anger and something that might have been hope, and I turned away before my mother could look up. Ben asked me later if I'd regretted not speaking to them, if I'd felt guilty walking away. I felt sad, I admitted. Sad that they chose this. Sad that they couldn't be who we needed them to be. Sad that they'll die having lost everything that mattered. But guilty? No. I protected you from people who wanted to harm you, even though they called it love. That's not something to feel guilty about. David called that night, some sixth sense telling him I needed to talk. We spent an hour on the phone discussing nothing important, brothers reconnecting in the space our parents' absence had created. He mentioned that Maya's family was planning a big reunion next summer, that his kids were asking if their cousin Ben could come, that they'd bought a house with enough rooms that extended family could visit. We built something better, he said. We built what they should have built if they'd been capable of it. The truth was simpler and harder than that. We'd survived what they'd built, and we'd chosen to build differently. They'd used love as a weapon and family as a cage, and we'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing was to walk away. They'd taught us what not to be, and in their absence we'd discovered what we could become. Ben works now with an organization that helps deprogram children from extremist ideology, using his own experience to guide others through similar recoveries. David's daughter asks him questions about her grandfather sometimes, and he answers honestly about the man who chose hate over knowing her. Maya's podcast has thousands of followers, people who need to hear that leaving toxic family isn't betrayal, but survival. And I work my shifts at the hospital, come home to a life I rebuilt after it imploded, and I feel the cold clarity that saved us transforming gradually into warmth. Not forgiveness, never that, but peace. Peace knowing that I chose correctly, protected the vulnerable, refused to enable evil just because it wore the face of family. My parents will die someday having lost everything they valued. Reputation, family, community, legacy. They'll die believing they were persecuted for righteousness, victims of a world that rejected their truth. And I'll receive the news without grief, knowing that they built their own ending with every choice they made after that first confrontation. The last time Ben mentioned them, he was 19 and home from college for Thanksgiving. We were preparing dinner at David and Maya's house, 3 generations working together, and Ben said something that crystallized everything. I used to think family meant people you couldn't escape. Now I know it means people you choose to keep choosing. He looked around the kitchen at David and Maya, at Maya's parents helping with dessert, at his cousin setting the table, and he smiled. This is family. Everything else was just an accident of genetics. My parents had taught him hate, but inadvertently taught him something more valuable. That love without respect is manipulation. That tradition without compassion is oppression. And that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is recognize poison, even when it's served with a smile. They'd meant to create another generation of themselves and instead created their own obsolescence. I keep one photo of them, tucked in a box in my closet where Ben found it once during a move. Do you ever miss who they could have been? He asked, looking at the picture of younger versions of my parents before their beliefs had calcified into cruelty. Every day, I admitted. But people are who they are, not who we wish they'd be. And they chose who they were over and over, even when it cost them everything. That's the lesson I hope Ben carries forward. People reveal themselves through their choices, especially the choices they make when loving you requires changing themselves. My parents chose their hate over their grandson, chose their ideology over their family, chose being right over being loving. And we chose ourselves, chose truth, chose the difficult work of building something better from the ashes of what they destroyed. They lost everything. We gained everything that matters. And that's not revenge. That's just consequence, the natural result of spending decades building a fortress on a foundation of hate. When the foundation cracked, everything fell, and they had no one to blame but the architects who designed it to fail.